kick off with you, Andrew. You were the co-convener for Te Tapeke Fair Futures panel. When you did this, what did you envision for Aotearoa when you put it together?
I was actually a bit sceptical, to be honest with you, about the idea of fairness as a concept. With my background in Te Tiriti and Indigenous rights, it was kind of like, I don't know if that will actually work for me, but I was, because really in the context of treaty rights, Te Tiriti and Indigenous rights, fairness seemed a little bit twee, to be honest with you. It seemed a little bit in the context of discussions where, you know, I might be talking to the North Americans about cultural genocide and conquest and you know, the history and the legacy of colonization. So, but of course I was curious, you know, and with Lau Goddard, who is a co-convener, a justice here in Aotearoa and who's judging over in Samoa at the moment, we talked about the potential it might have as a concept because of its capacity, I think, to transcend cultures, because I was curious about whether, and you know, Crucial was the expert in this area about tikanga Māori and what connections there might be with Māori concepts of justification, validation, legitimacy with fairness, and also the crossover with Te Tiriti and treaty jurisprudence. So it was stimulating, yeah, and I'm hoping that the papers that we produced reflect that. I think they do as well, yeah.
So much has changed since you were all brought together. We've seen a global pandemic. We've seen huge shifts politically across the globe. We've seen increasing threats regionally. As a Pacific scholar, I have some thoughts about threats. And we've seen shifts at home also. I wonder if each of you could speak to how you think we can ensure fairness for all, or for all groups and societies as we navigate these really big shifts and changes.
Tēnā tātou, ka mihi mai hoa kia koutou I tēnei pō. First, we should be mindful of the way in which the burdens of change are often unevenly and unfairly distributed to begin with, right? The places where the greatest change, or in fact often any change at all, is felt are by those already unfairly disadvantaged. And the other thing that we might want to bear in mind is to view these changes really as opportunities to be a bit more courageous in the way we think about where transformations and the kinds of changes that we're looking for can really take us and what we can do to facilitate that change.
Kia ora. The world we face at the moment, I can't think of another time where the future is so uncertain, really. I don't know what the next 10 years is going to hold, let alone the next 50, with sort of climate change and sort of AI and other technological changes. So I don't know exactly how we can try and address those things, but I think there's some basics that we can get to, and of course I'm biased a little bit with the introduction that Siriana gave me. We can try and give people the best start in life that we can. So children in New Zealand start their lives on unequal footings, and there's things that we can do about that. I've been working with, collaborating with a researcher to look at the impact of the 2018 Families Package on children's outcomes. So that's where it was a suite of things, but as part of that there was the Best Start, $60 a week, up to $60 a week for families. And we're looking into what impact that has had on children. And there's some good and bad news. The bad news is that it doesn't have that big of an effect, and this is something that's shown kind of worldwide, but it does have some effects. It has been, we're suggesting, or showing at least, that it reduces rates of child abuse, and which is kind of timely given the what Anu's been working on. So the best start in life, I think, is one way that we can ensure that we have a better future for everyone. Another thing that I did a review of recently was relating to Ka Ora Ka Ako, the Food in Schools program, which was a big discussion as a sort of policy issue a few months ago. They decided to continue it. The evidence I've seen suggests that in one part of the country it's managed to reduce childhood overweight, so having better food to children actually does help. And I suppose the other thing I'd say about making sure all groups are able to thrive is just to make sure that we understand their needs properly, which requires data, which is again another bias of mine. If Jay were here, he might have talked about the fact that the government is considering implementing a refugee survey to understand that population, which would be a really, really good thing to do. So yeah, just sort of best start in life for children and understand a whole range of populations.
Just to add to what Barry said, one of the things that was like a mantra in the abuse and care wānanga and the kui we had around the country with Māori communities, but also disability and Pacifica is empowering communities, giving them the resources and capacity and trusting communities to come up with the solutions to local needs. And they would also say that that's kind of happening in with devolution. We've had this experience for several decades now of social provision, but there was stress and this is something the tribunal report has talked about a lot, is all the strings attached to those policies and the lack of trust, basically, is what they were saying. And this assumption, spoken assumption within officialdom that, for example, Māori cannot be trusted to care for their own and to do good work. And that was something that we heard consistently, and the need to change the paradigms rather than a kind of top-down devolution of social provision to Māori, but also disability whānau as well. Enabling good lives is a model that's still a pilot that hasn't been rolled out across all regions as it was meant to be, but also from Pacifica whānau too, is that let's change the thinking so that there's more of a and we were just talking before we spoke about the Harvard Indigenous Project, the JFK Kennedy School of Government, which for 30 years has been testing this idea about shifting from devolution to a more of a self-determination model, which is about trusting communities to do the work themselves, because they're closer to the problems and they know what the solutions are. And there's more accountability within these communities. So anyway, yeah, that's follow on from Barry. It's a very strong message we heard across the nation.
I wonder if I can weave and ask Andrew, the abuse and care report is about to be released. And this is quite a significant moment that many families, communities and people, it brings to light a lot of stories that many people in Aotearoa will not have been aware of. So it'll be a moment of reckoning for all of us, I think. How do we, I guess, interrupt that history of unfairness in our society and make sure it doesn't continue, particularly when it comes to our young people? What do we need to do differently?
Yeah, I mean, I was just reading something before I came in this morning from two young people who are in care just recently, just demonstrating that this is a problem that continues. And talking and making that point is that abuse and care is not a historical matter, and I think in terms of fairness, Stephen Winters here is expert on redress, but I turn to that call issue of redress and apology and compensation and support, real meaningful support that's ongoing for survivors of abuse. So I think that's really, to get that right is so key. Survivors have been waiting for such a long time and have been frustrated by the myriad pathways to getting redress through different institutions, and it just needs to be a lot easier to access. It needs to be more empathetic, and it needs to be more substantial and responsive. And we just, even today, although we released a report about this, I think it's 2 years ago, about the need for immediate redress for survivors, and the response from the Prime Minister at the time is that this was going to be a priority. We still don't have a redress scheme in place. So I know the Prime Minister has said in news this week there will be a national apology in November, and so that's good to see, and hopefully there's engagement with survivor communities on the content and process related to that. But I think redress for me is the number one issue. that is outstanding, that needs to be resolved promptly. Yeah.
Wanaka. I wonder, following from that piece, right, we've talked a little bit, Crucial's kind of outlined, really helped us to that challenge of our underlying assumptions, and you've talked about how we can move through to redress. And so I'm going to pivot a bit to Barry and say, I've become a recent data convert. I am very bad at maths and numbers, but I've started to understand how data can help us to tell the same stories a little bit differently and help us to think about these issues in different ways and bring other people into the conversation. I wonder if you could give us some kind of understanding of how large data sets shape and how we understand ourselves and fairness in society.
Large data sets are great for some things and not so good for other things, and they don't always, for instance, pick up the priorities that communities have for themselves. But large data sets that governments often collect, and I'll include the census in there, are great for monitoring the way a population is and monitoring how it changes over time in terms of inequalities and other sorts of things that are related to fairness. But there are limitations. So I worked on a project a few years ago with Ministry of Social Development where we were interested in seeing if we could use already collected data to construct a tikanga-informed Māori strengths-based community index. And we worked for a few months on that and we said no. It can't be done because it doesn't have the stuff that's important for communities. In order to find out what's important for communities, you go directly and speak to them. So the government data, excluding the census and one or two other bits and pieces, by and large tends to be deficit focused because you only interact with government services when things go wrong, when you're unwell or when you get arrested or when you get put into care, for instance, to give an example. So that captures, it doesn't tell us how happy we are. There's lots of things that I think it's really important, and it's picking up on your point as well. I think communities are coming to realise that some of the data that do exist does tell them about themselves to some extent. And I think there needs to be a push, and this is a fairness issue, I think, to broaden the availability of data to communities, I think. It's locked up for nerds like myself too often, I think, for reasons that I can understand around confidentiality and protection of disclosure risk and those sorts of things. But that narrows the range of questions that you can ask of the data, I think. And communities will inevitably have different questions that someone like I wouldn't have.
I really appreciate that talanoa about the limitations and possibilities within data, particularly given the rest of the talanoa around how do we involve our community more in creating a fair future and how do we empower ourselves. As I think a little bit about what we've traversed, we've talked a little bit about past and contemporary moments, but I wonder if each of you would like to comment on and you kind of already have, but this is your like, what's your mic drop moment as we look at this panel? No pressure, no pressure. Are there what interventions could we make today, or what could people take away from today to think about fairer futures for Aotearoa?
I think this is an interesting moment in our history with the coalition government and this issue about co-governance and race-based privilege. And so it does seem that we've reached a point where we've made great achievements through treaty settlements and historical reparations that's somehow been immune to challenges on the basis of race-based privilege because it's kind of nation to nation, tribe to tribe. And so even treaty settlements that have co-management or co-governance arrangements are not really attacked by politicians, but we've reached a bump in the road where we're trying to move beyond historical reparations to this kind of process of belated state building. And that is, more effective participation of Māoris, not only Māori, but other, vulnerable minorities in decision making. and also, this idea of self-determination. The US scholars are saying it means that, the more autonomy that tribes have, they knock it out of the park. They perform, they prosper economically, and the well-being for their members, improves dramatically. So I still have faith in maybe put it this way, New Zealand's sense of fairness that we'll get through this. Anyway, so that's dwelling on that at the moment.
I think I'd say that there is a great deal to learn from Māori and other Indigenous communities around the world about how to enact change in even the harshest context and under conditions of intergenerational oppression. Many communities across Aotearoa New Zealand, marae communities and others, are working in ways that enact socio-environmental responsibilities, or where relevant, kaitiakitanga, where they're developing their own well-being indicators, for instance. And so investment in and learning from these communities and initiatives is critical. We can start then by thinking about justice and fairness in terms of our responsibilities that we have to each other, to the natural environment, and to future generations. And we can think about how we motivate responsibility taking and enable communities to do that going forward. Kia ora.
Mic drop thing, perhaps, is, and this is where I'm going to talk about things I don't really know too much about, just thinking about the future and thinking about technological change and thinking about ageing, I do wonder if A, it's a good idea, and B, it's almost inevitable that some sort of universal basic income becomes reality. It potentially, again, I'm not an expert on this, and there's lots of debates for and against it, why these are good things or bad things. But if technological change brings about sort of job losses, which may or may not happen, it's been predicted with other technological changes, so who really knows? But if it does, and I think something like a universal basic income might become almost inevitable and potentially a good solution. And the other thing I think it solves as well, and this is an unfairness issue, is the retirement age issue. So we've got a retirement age at 65 now, and when people reach 65, some of them can work for another 20 years, and other of them shouldn't have been working the last 5 because their body's knackered. And so with a basic income there, retirement age goes out of the question. It's just there for everyone. So whether that's the mic drop moment, I'm not sure, but that's what I'm going to leave with, I think. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, Chris just said to me, data. I mean, having them understand how they're worse off. They may know that already. I'm not sure. Is fairness a concept they think about too often? Again, I'm just not sure. Teach it in schools. I mean, other than sort of making aware of, more aware of their own situation, if they're in their own pocket, which is often the case, you're in your own bubble a little bit, probably even more so now with social media, then data can help a little bit, but again, it's not a full panacea, I don't think.
Yeah, great question, kia ora. So I was just thinking, just on the point about education, one of the things that we might want to educate our broader communities about is, to sort of have the moral imagination required to imagine the sufferings of other people, right? And to educate them about that. And that's going to require a sort of taking a bigger picture view, right? So that we can't hide from the challenges, and we can't hide from the histories, and we can't hide from the ways in which we've come to where we are, and how, in fact, we impact on each other's lives all the time, right? And sort of trying to figure out ways in which we can kind of reconnect people, right? Because often all of our communities are disconnected. So there's quite a range of things in which we can do, but yeah.
Yeah, lovely. Just on the back of that, I think too, the consciousness raising, we were talking before about the TRC, abuse and care report in Canada, and the impact that had on raising awareness of abuse in the community. And it cuts across all people, but largely impoverished peoples. Māori Pākehā, you know, South Asia, if you're from that socioeconomic bracket, then you're going to be more vulnerable than others. And so, you know, you think of Auckland and you think about the Greyland communities, and you think of South Auckland and how, speaking of bubbles, you know, it's just getting awareness of what's happening. And we've got a Waitangi Tribunal member here, and I often think about the reports. Are a great resource, fantastic resource about our history, but no one reads them. And well, apart from Māori lawyers, but that's not fair. I mean, a lot of people read them, but they don't really get out into the community, you know. And maybe we could do more to send that message out. In an accessible way, but that consciousness raising, I think, is a critical part of this, to develop empathy, right, for your brothers and sisters in your community and a sense of community. It just seems that we're so atomised now that we just kind of look after ourselves. I think just having these conversations outside of our ivory towers are good, because it's good to have this gathering for the Royal Society. I think it was a great idea. You know, we were an ivory tower, you know, the Royal Society, an elite institution, you know, but we came from many different backgrounds, and we all got together and we had a crack at it. And we produced these shorter, you know, pieces, a couple of pages long, nice and accessible, just to stimulate discussion and get debate going. But yes, very lengthy report, 5 years in the making, 14 kilos apparently. But there's an executive summary, which is, a bit more accessible. But now we're still just trying to find ways to move the conversation outside of the universities and these other institutions, and so it's not just an echo chamber, so it's just not, you know, speaking to one another.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, your question is, how do you turn evidence into policy? Because I mean, those reports themselves sitting up there or sitting wherever they are aren't going to change anything. It needs changes at the policy level. So the question is, how does the information in there get through either directly or indirectly to policymakers? And you're just picking up on Andrew's point with, you know, circulating ideas. I can't remember exactly, but I'm not sure if we made too many concrete suggestions about what should happen, but what we said is we highlighted the issues and highlighted you know, potential solutions that could be put forward there. You know, we're talking here to you lot, but we could also think about talking directly to government about some of the things that we ourselves worked on in that, or maybe the wider report generally. I don't know if that's the idea of Royal Society, but you know, we need to talk to people that actually make the decisions, I think.
I also think that maybe we, just on that point about policy, I think we could probably try harder to rethink our policy infrastructure, so that knowledge from our communities that we're all celebrating and that we're all saying is vital to kind of the change that we need to face, and that needs to occur, can actually make it to policymakers, right, in the correct way. So we need the right kind of epistemic infrastructure, which I think we tried to model as a panel, and then try and figure out how that can impact on the kind of policy infrastructure that we have. So it's not just scholars talking to policymakers, but it's communities directly.
We knew this was an issue. It's about how we involved particular voices that weren't around the table at the time. Remember, like rangatahi voices, for example. Yeah, but we did acknowledge, you know, amongst ourselves that there was this issue about this deficit, about representation and the conversation, and we talked about different ways of addressing that, including, you know, touring the country and having conversations. But we ran out of time, and COVID really kind of intervened right smack in the middle of these plans to address that. But it's a very good point. I think that would have really assisted us. Yeah.
Yeah, we certainly discussed the fact that we were bobbleheads sitting around discussing things, and you know, the idea of deliberative democracy, as I understand it, is you get a group of people together that represents, or maybe it's a community, or maybe it represents different areas, and they nut out the issues and bring a kind of a non-academic perspective to things. We didn't get to that point. I think, but I think it's, look, how long? We took probably 3-4 meetings to discuss what fairness meant to us. I think the deliberative democracy would probably get it done in a couple of hours, maybe. But, so I think that it's important to include those voices, and I am aware, a little bit at least, of how they have been used, more so, I think, in Europe, to solve important questions. We discussed that very point. How do you convince people who think things are okay that actually things are unfair? And what we came to is, well, let's present them with some evidence. They think things are fair. Let's challenge their beliefs. And so that's what we set out to do with those, however many there are, reports. You think it's fair in terms of housing? Have a look at this. You think it's fair in terms of health? Have a look at this, etc. So that's not telling them directly things are unfair, and saying that this should be your view of fairness. It's just, it's saying you may have these preconceptions about how New Zealand is, let's show you it's a little bit different, and maybe that shifts your dial slightly.
The second question was, what is fairness given its... yeah, how can you agree? Yeah.
Entirely right. Like that was the question for me. I mean, what is an Indigenous view of fairness, or according to Te Tiriti, what is fairness? I'm not sure how you. I'm not sure how you. What's that idea of overlapping consensus making? Who's that philosopher about trying to reconcile different views? Or maybe that's the purpose of a liberal democracy. That's working properly. And by that I don't mean it's kind of, the atomised individual being the same as everyone else, but a real democracy that respects the voice of everyone, that through that, if that's done well, then you have that sense of fairness kind of reflected in policy and law, people getting together and deliberating and solving and disagreeing and solving problems.
I mean, I also think that, just following on from what I've said about taking a big picture view, it's really difficult to kind of not feel like we're in this together, right? It's really, it's unclear whether there'll be a future of any sort, right, for future generations. And so once we grant that, I mean, many of these people are the filthy rich. What's the point of the life that they're living if there's no future? So we really have to force ourselves, we don't have to force ourselves that hard, but there's a real kind of urgency and moral requirement to work together, to figure that out. Call it fairness, call it trying to flourish into the future together, right? We have to take that seriously. I think when we take a big picture view, it's not too difficult to convince people that they have a stake in what the future might be like.
I think at least with equality for me, it's as long as we understand it's more than just formal equality about equal treatment, and that we have that, we clear that includes substantive equality, and so that it's about outcomes, right? It's about making sure that everyone gets, and that I think is connected to that sense of fairness, about moving away from kind of rigid ways of, we're all kind of atomised, identical sort of widgets that should be treated the same. So if it's a disability or ethnicity or what have you, that there's accommodation of that. I can't say much more than that. The Māori elites issue, I think, is often heard in those circles, and I think it's an easy catchphrase, bandy about. But as I was saying before, I do think there needs to be introspection and consideration within Māori political. The movement, if you call it that, about things, about how we can have more cohesion between different identities, for example, over Māori authorities and tribal structures, stronger relationships between hapu and iwi bodies, ways of resolving disagreement that don't involve going to the courts, more democracy in decision-making, more decision-making within communities about what the content of tikanga is, for example, in process. So there is there's work to be done, right? So I acknowledge that, and but that sort of conversation is a difficult and nuanced and complex question, and the idea of Māori elites is just a simple sort of catchphrase that doesn't have much meaning at all, really, when set next to this. So yeah.
So yeah, that depends. I mean, just back to the question here, really interesting point about how different people think about fairness, and what's the basic assumptions that are kind of underpinning those conceptions of fairness, and how we actually have to have conversations about those basic assumptions to figure out what we really agree on and disagree on, and what the limits of our ideas about fairness and justice and all those other related concepts really are. I think it depends. I think it's tricky to pinpoint. I mean, of course, in the Western philosophical tradition, like many of us know, we have these kinds of principles of justice, and we kind of have reasons for pursuing them. But I think we're in such radically different circumstances that we need to kind of really think about what kind of, if any, principles at all we might need, right, going forward. So I think that's what I would say. I'd take an intergenerational approach and say, because often those principles of justice that we find in the Western tradition don't think about the future in quite the way we need to today anyway. So yeah, I think we could possibly come up with sort of general principles, but I think the really important question is, how do we live together well, given the circumstances that we're facing and the futures that we might face? That's the question that we need to start asking ourselves and really taking seriously, I think.
Manaka whakalevu to our panellists. As always, it's enlightening to get to spend time with each of you. And I want to thank each of you for coming through tonight to share in this conversation and to kind of think a bit more. And I think also rise to the challenge of, well, how do we take the work that you've done and spread it so that we can have conversations about fairness more broadly in Aotearoa. So I invite you to make sure you pick up some of the reports and make sure you give it to that difficult co-worker/family member, and just kind of maybe make one family dinner uncomfortable. It's fine. I think that's a fun invitation for each of you that can help us all rise to the challenge of this. And with that, I'd like to invite our kaumātua Bobby to come forward to close us. Yes, Mātua Bobby.
Ai, ko tai rā ki te mutunga, te kohuri te kei o te waka. And I think it's a big thank you to our facilitator and to our panel tonight. Nā reira ho mai te paki. Ke hora te marino, ke whakapapa paunamu te moana, ke tere te kārohirohi. May the calm be widespread, may the waters glisten like the green stone, and may the sun, or the moon, bring warmth and joy across your pathway as we journey in life. Tēnā koutou, kia ora tātou.